Hey, what's good, everybody? Welcome to Fundamental Friday. The market just closed, and I wanted to do a little recap about where it's at and where I think things could be headed from a fundamental picture. So let's get right into it. Here we have GJ, the British Pound Japanese Yen. So as you see, this week we saw a very aggressive sell-off. Um, just as the yen strength and also the pound was seeing some weakness due to Brexit worries. Um, so, knowing this information, we did get a pullback um, starting around a day or two ago. So, looking at the pound where it's at right now, there's still, of course, Brexit fears. Not even close to a deal with the EU by any standard. And so, because of that, that's sort of weighing on the pound, keeping it down. Besides that, though, it kind of wants to rally. A lot of buyers in the pound. If we go take a look at um, the pound USD. So, looking at the pound US dollar, it's sort of been in this range. It wants to rally, but these fears are keeping it down. I would say, um, as it stands right now, more of a neutral bias. I don't see this thing completely selling off, breaking new lows, or breaking these highs anytime soon. Probably consolidation until we get a little more of a stance with how the whole Brexit talks are going with the EU, but also with other countries like Japan and the United States. If there's positive developments there, we could see a nice push up for the pound. But if not, I see some more consolidation. So fairly neutral bias on the pound as it stands right now. Now looking back here at GJ, looking at the yen, overall the yen has actually been fairly strong, partially due to just fears overall about the general economy, and also talks about the Fed increasing quantitative easing and possibly negative rates, which is obviously perceived as not good. That was the main topic over the last day or two. So we've seen recently here GJ with the yen. We've had a bit of a sell-off with a pullback coming later on in the week. I think it's right now just looking for direction, in terms of risk, whether investors are want to be more risk averse, or want to be greedy right now because they think maybe the market's bottomed out. And where I see this headed, honestly, is up. I see the yen as a little bit more bearish, meaning GJ would go higher, and the reason for that is again, not looking at a technical standpoint, but if we want to get into that, it is at a strong level of support. But fundamentally, the chances of negative rates happening are fairly low. A lot of people are confused why the market was even considering that would be, a possibility, which it still is. But I think that a lot of people are realizing, we shouldn't be pricing this in too heavily. So I don't think that'll be that big of a factor. And right now, Japan's economy, it's still suffering. It's been suffering for a good 2 years now. Nothing's changed. The only thing that ever keeps the yen, up is when there's fears. When there's not fears, this thing, usually headed lower. This thing sells off when fear dies down. So I see this thing headed higher for the next week or two. I don't know if anytime soon we're going to get a break of these highs, but I do see some upside for GJ for the time being, given that the pound stays more neutral. Now, moving into the Australian dollar. Here we have it. And again, like usual, the fundamentals for the Australian dollar is usually very, very similar for the New Zealand dollar. So, just keep that in mind. But right now for the Australian dollar, we saw a nice move down. Last week, there was some fear in the market over U.S. and China tensions. But this week they met, they talked. Things seem to be going a lot better. So we have seen a nice move lower for, or higher, I should say, for the Australian dollar. Nice move lower here for GA. Now, where do I see this thing headed? Honestly, it did break this low here over the last day or two. Honestly, right now, again, given the pound's neutral positioning, and given it stays that way, or even becomes more bearish, I see this thing headed lower. Of course, a pullback, might be coming, but I do see this thing over the next week or two possibly lower. For the main fact, like I said, investors are getting more greedy. We're seeing, case numbers, coronavirus going down. U.S.-China tensions, as it stands right now, are going a lot better, which helps the markets. And Australia is doing decent, with how they handled the coronavirus and their case numbers. Everything is just looking good over there. So I see this thing headed lower. Very similar picture for GN. Very similar. So, of course, the Australian dollar and the New Zealand dollar are risk averse, or they are risk currencies, risk on currencies, and so they change with risk, right? Not so much the pound, but these currencies especially take risk sentiment into account. So basically, we saw a nice sell-off. Basically, the same reason the Australian dollar did. There was risk on flows this week because the U.S. met with China and because case numbers are going down. And also, similar to Australia, New Zealand handled the coronavirus very well. Low case numbers. I see a very similar picture for GN. I see this thing maybe pulling back, but I see it headed lower unless something changes for the pound or U.S.-China tensions start bubbling up. But as it stands right now, I see this thing headed lower from a fundamental perspective. From a technical perspective, it also broke this low, so there's a potential for it to make a correction and then head further down. Another reason I am saying that we could see some more risk on next week or possibly going into the week after is if we look here at US 30, which tracks basically the Dow, the S&P, the general market. If my Wi-Fi wants to cooperate, we will see this thing's quite bullish, right? Making higher highs every step of the way. Next week we could possibly test this level. Buyers are confident right now, and this carries over into what happens with currencies. If this thing starts rallying, we're gonna see some yen weakness. We're gonna see some Aussie strength, most likely, right? Everything's correlated. Sometimes more than others. But when right now the market's looking for risk sentiment, a lot of times they look at the overall market, aka the S&P, the Dow Jones, the Nasdaq. So right now this is looking more bullish, meaning the yen is looking more bearish, and the Australian dollar is looking, and New Zealand dollar are looking bullish. So that's where I see these things headed. Now, moving on to the euro. Let's take a look at Euro USD first. The euro was pretty weak this week. It sold off mostly for two reasons. One, of course, Europe as a whole, well, also Germany, but Europe as a whole has been struggling with this virus. Of course, Italy, Germany have been hit pretty hard. Spain, they're struggling with this virus, which has affected the economy, which was already, on the brink of a recession before this virus came about. And so right now they're really struggling financially, which has kept this thing down. And on top of that, this week, the German courts ruled one of the ECB's policies unconstitutional, right? So there's a little bit of a beef within the European Union which of course is not very reassuring to investors, especially since all this craziness is going on. So as it stands right now, it's looking more weak. The euro is pretty weak in my mind as it stands. Now, I think next week we could be seeing more neutral territory, depending on news, what's happening with, of course, this court ruling and just the economy as a whole, coronavirus numbers, etc., is all going to play a factor in this. But as it stands right now, not too much buying interest in the euro. And so looking here at euro Australian, we can see same thing. Australian dollar was very strong this week. Now, I'm still, of course, I'm short. I'm not actually short, but short bias on this. I would, of course, need to wait for a good entry. But the reason for that is, like I said, euro pretty weak at the moment. And I think we're going to be seeing some more risk-on flows going into next week, the week after. So similar situation with GAGN. I see this thing potentially pulling back and breaking into new lows. Now, EN, again, very similar picture. And it actually did break this low, but it's trying to hold. I see this thing headed lower into next week. Of course, we have this very strong level of support. It would need to break that, but yeah, I see further downside for these two pairs. Next up, EJ, Euro JPY. Very nice short this week. With EJ, you had a weak euro and a strong yen. It was the perfect short, technically and fundamentally. Of course, like I mentioned, with the yen, we saw a pullback at the start of the week. At the end of the week. Where I see this headed, probably a little bit more consolidation, just because I think the yen will become a little weaker, and of course the euro is currently weak. So I see this thing consolidating. No really strong moves to the upside or downside as it stands right now. But of course, from a technical picture, it's going to have a hard time, breaking above these highs. So just be aware of that. Now, I usually don't go over this in my, normal fundamental recaps, but I'm going to cover gold here. So gold, of course, is bullish. Why? Because the world is in a terrible economic situation, and gold thrives on that. Gold is a safe haven. When people are scared, gold goes up. People buy gold. So, knowing this information, if we see the chances of negative interest rates in the United States, this thing will fly up. Basically, any bad news, this thing, will head and eventually probably break these highs. But even if nothing changes and things go how they should, there's still probably going to be a large demand for gold. And near term, aka the next week or two, it could consolidate. I'm not saying it's going to fly up, but I would not be going short. I would be, the fundamentals are all pointing long, and so I would just wait any opportunity you get to buy gold at a decent price. But yeah, for sure bullish. Everything's pointing up. Analysts are predicting 1,800 to potentially 1,900 price on gold, which is currently, oh boy. All right, well, here's my sort of technicals. But it's roughly almost 1,000 pips from 1,800 and 2,000 pips to 1,900. So a lot of potential move to capture there. But yeah, guys, that is all for this week. Have a great weekend. Study, relax, prepare for next week. It's going to be a nice week ahead, I believe. There's some nice trends that seem to be starting to form. We'll just have to see how news goes, how things play out. But Yeah, guys, I hope you learned something from this video. I hope you take what I say and possibly implement it into your trading, or if nothing else, use the process of how I think about fundamentals, and implement it into your trading. Have a great weekend, guys. I will see you next Tuesday.